Recently, a policy allowing workers earning under $100,000 a year to keep their tips and overtime pay tax-free has been making waves across the country, a major boon for lower-income and middle-class Americans, especially those grinding away in restaurants, retail, and logistics. But here's the kicker. Since government coffers don't just shrink out of nowhere, the Trump administration decided to make up for lost revenue by cranking up trade tariffs on key partners like Canada, Mexico, and China, slapping higher duties on imported goods. Starting February 1st, a series of swift tariff measures rolled out, including a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico, an extra 10% on Canadian energy products, and a 10% tariff on Chinese goods. While the tariffs on Canadian and Mexican products were delayed for a month thanks to promises of beefed-up border controls, those on Chinese goods kicked in immediately. Then on February 27th, Trump surprised everyone on social media by announcing that from March 4th onward, the 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports would be enforced, with Chinese goods facing an additional 10% tariff to push their overall duty up to 20%. On top of all this, the U.S. imposed a 25% tariff on all imported steel and aluminum, and extra taxes on key industries like automobiles, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and lumber, while also launching a fresh tariff investigation against the EU and planning another round on copper, all in a bid to expand its trade protection playbook. Though this policy is touted at home as a move to rebuild manufacturing and protect American workers, its real impact is far more complicated than the White House would have you believe. So if you're digging what you hear today, drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more updates. On the surface, the Trump administration's push for these tariff policies is all about plugging the fiscal gap and backing the tax-free treatment for tips and overtime pay, but there's a deeper play at work driven by both economic and political agendas. Essentially, it's a continuation of his America First strategy, using tariff barriers to force manufacturing back onshore, cut down on foreign dependence, and keep the heat on major trading rivals to boost the competitiveness of U.S. production. The catch is that modern global supply chains are so intertwined that merely slapping on tariffs isn't likely to reshape the manufacturing landscape. In fact, it could just jack up costs for businesses and weaken America's own market edge. Moreover, the timing of these tariff hikes reeks of clear political motives. With midterm elections looming, raising tariffs not only wins over blue-collar voters, especially those in the Rust Belt who rely on manufacturing, but also serves as a bargaining chip in future trade talks with China, Canada, and Mexico. Case in point, on February 20th, Trump dropped hints about a possible trade deal with China, only to flip the script a week later by announcing new tariff hikes. A capricious move meant to stir uncertainty and pressure his negotiating partners into concessions. To add insult to injury, the administration controversially linked these tariffs to the drug issue, specifically blaming China and Mexico for flooding the U.S. with fentanyl, a serious societal problem that claims tens of thousands of lives each year. Yet tying trade policy to the drug crisis doesn't really tackle the root of the problem. After all, China had already ramped up controls on fentanyl precursors in 2020 while working with the U.S. on drug enforcement, and Mexico has repeatedly shown a willingness to help curb cross-border smuggling. So wrapping the tariff policy in a fight against drugs narrative seems more like political spin than a genuine fix. History also warns us against such moves. The infamous 1930 Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, for instance, aimed to protect U.S. industries during the Great Depression, but ended up shrinking international trade and deepening the economic slump. And the 2018 trade war with China didn't bring manufacturing back home, but instead saddled American businesses and consumers with higher costs. With this latest round of tariff hikes, it appears we're staring down a repeat of past mistakes, a lesson that should give all of us pause. The tariff policy's impact on Canada, Mexico, and China is both immediate and far-reaching. Canada and Mexico have long relied on the U.S. market. By 2023, Mexico's exports to America accounted for 80% of its total, while Canada's stood at 77.6%. A 25% tariff is bound to hit these nations' export businesses hard, especially in industries like automotive, energy, and agriculture. For instance, Mexico's auto manufacturing is deeply tied to the U.S., and Canada's oil exports depend heavily on American demand. With tariffs raising the cost of their goods, competitiveness will take a nosedive, potentially leading to layoffs and even major supply chain disruptions. In response, both nations will have to hustle to find new trading partners and reduce their reliance on the U.S. Canada might boost exports to Europe and Asia, and Mexico could deepen trade ties with South American countries. But such shifts aren't going to happen overnight, and short-term economic losses are a real risk. Moreover, if the U.S.-Canada-Mexico trade relationship suffers too much, it could jeopardize the North American economic integration that's been in place since 1994. For China, an extra 10% tariff will further erode the price edge of its products in America, hitting sectors like electronics and machinery the hardest. Chinese companies will need to streamline their supply chains, branch out into Southeast Asia and Europe, and enhance their products' value to cut down on U.S. dependency, a move that's both time-consuming and costly, especially amid supply chain overhauls. And let's not forget American consumers. Price hikes on everyday items like furniture, toys, and clothing will hit the average family right where it hurts, cranking up costs at the checkout. For everyday Americans, the impact of these tariff policies is as complex as it is far-reaching. The Trump administration touts that the extra revenue will help plug the fiscal gap and support the tax-free treatment for tips and overtime pay. A definite win for workers who depend on those extra bucks. But the real kicker is that the cost of these tariffs usually ends up getting shoved onto consumers, driving up prices, especially in sectors that lean heavily on imports. Historical evidence backs this up. After the U.S. hit imported large household washing machines with a 50% tariff in 2018, prices jumped 12% within a year, meaning consumers paid an extra $86 per washer on average, while even dryers, not directly taxed, saw price hikes of $92 due to increased supply chain costs, piling up to an extra $1.5 billion in consumer spending, all while the supposed job boost only added about 1,800 positions at an astronomical cost of roughly $800,000 per job. The solar industry paints a similar picture. When a 30% tariff was slapped on imported solar panels in 2018, prices shot up 16% in the first year, causing installation costs to climb, market demand to drop, and nearly 20,000 layoffs in the U.S. solar sector, proving that instead of bolstering domestic manufacturing, these tariffs merely stunted industry growth. On an even grander scale, during the U.S.-China trade war of 2018 to 2019, the average tariff on Chinese goods skyrocketed from 3.1% to 20.9%, inflicting a staggering $125 billion in extra costs on American businesses and consumers, with widespread price hikes in items like furniture, toys, electronics, and clothing. Economists estimate that these tariffs have driven up each American household's annual spending by over $1,300 and trimmed U.S. GDP by roughly 0.3% to 0.5%. For American manufacturing, tariffs cut both ways. The Trump administration argues that imposing these duties forces companies to cut their dependence on foreign supply chains and instead buy or make more domestically produced goods, ideally driving manufacturing back to the States. But history tells a different story. While tariffs can boost local production in theory, they also hike up costs that can weaken overall competitiveness and hit some sectors especially hard. First off, high tariffs spike production costs. Take steel and aluminum as examples. After the new tariff adjustments, steel products from China face a combined duty of 70%, while aluminum holds steady at 25%. That's a serious cost punch to industries like automotive, construction, home appliances, and infrastructure. Back in 2018, when Trump first imposed tariffs on these metals, domestic steel prices soared by 40%, bumping up the cost of manufacturing cars by about $175 per vehicle, and raising construction expenses by 5%, all of which ultimately slowed down real estate and infrastructure projects. If the steel tariff kicks in, similar cost hikes could easily double. Next, consider how globalized today's supply chains are. Many American companies rely on overseas parts and raw materials, so when tariffs push up import costs, firms are forced to either pay more or scramble to find domestic alternatives. which isn't always realistic. Look at the semiconductor industry, for instance. U.S. chipmakers depend on supply chains in Asia, importing critical materials and chips from China, Taiwan, and Korea. If even higher tariffs are added to semiconductor products, companies like Intel, Qualcomm, and AMD could see their manufacturing costs balloon, hurting their global competitiveness and perhaps even prompting them to shift more operations to lower tariff regions. During the 2019 trade tussle with China, Apple famously moved part of its production to Vietnam and India instead of reshoring to the U.S., a textbook example of supply chains reacting to tariff shocks. Trump has even claimed that Tim Cook closed 2 factories in Mexico to avoid tariffs, and that Cook's promised hundreds of millions in U.S. investments will follow, though many remain skeptical. For instance, back in May 2020, TSMC announced a $12 billion investment to build a semiconductor plant in Arizona, with production set to kick off by the end of 2024. But due to technical and cost challenges, that timeline was pushed to 2025. Meanwhile, TSMC's later move to build in Japan actually started production in 2024. Then there's the auto industry. The U.S. imports a huge number of vehicles and parts from Mexico every year. If a 25% tariff is slapped on Mexican autos, estimates suggest that the average car price in America could jump by $2,000 to $4,000. During the 2018 U.S.-Canada-Mexico trade spat, major automakers like Ford, GM, and Honda warned that such tariffs would tank their U.S. sales and hit factory jobs hard. Some estimates even pegged a potential drop of 1.2 million vehicles in U.S. sales, with more than 100,000 jobs lost. In other words, while Trump's tariff strategy is pitched as a way to protect the U.S. auto industry, it might actually shrink the sector and hurt the job market in the long run. One more thing to note is that U.S. manufacturing has long been grappling with labor shortages and high operating costs. Even if tariffs push some companies to cut their dependence on foreign parts, that doesn't mean they'll rush to build plants on American soil. Wages, land costs, and environmental standards in the U.S. are way steeper than in China, Mexico, or Southeast Asia. If we force reshoring, businesses might simply pivot toward automation rather than creating more jobs. Take the 2018 trade war, for example. Harley-Davidson, hit with soaring steel and aluminum costs, shifted part of its production to Thailand to avoid losing ground in Europe, and Tesla ramped up building factories in Germany and China after 2022 instead of expanding in the U.S. Sure, some domestic sectors might catch a break. Steel companies like U.S. Steel and Nucor saw a short-term boost when imported steel dwindled. But overall, the reshuffling of supply chains and rising costs from these tariffs could destabilize U.S. manufacturing, possibly even prompting companies to move operations overseas, which runs counter to the policy's original intent. In the long run, Trump's tariff strategy is a high-stakes economic and political gamble. While it might help project an image of protecting domestic industries and fund tax breaks for some working folks in the short term, the inevitable price hikes, increased business costs, and escalating trade tensions could ultimately harm the American economy even more. History tells us that tariffs rarely bring manufacturing back home. Instead, they tend to fragment global supply chains and hurt U.S. economic interests. So how this tariff storm will evolve and who will end up taking the biggest hit remains a big question. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. See you next time.